Okay. So yeah, this is the kind of damage, my data-oriented damage system that I want to be showcasing. Again, this is kind of like the foundational layer of my kind of more complex combat system that I've used in a couple of different projects. And I feel like this is going to be a really good starting point to just kind of introduce you all to some of these concepts. And then I'm thinking that the week after next is the next time that I'll be up for showcasing the main project of the week. Is when I'll get into the combat system a little bit more, kind of talking about doing some more complex things with abilities and everything like that. But for the first one, I really just wanted to showcase essentially just kind of like introduce you to what the damage system is and some of the cool things that you can do with Unity ECS here. So I'll go ahead and just real quickly just kind of go through and just give you a quick overview about what's happening in this sample scene here, and then we can get into a little bit more of the code so you can get a better sense of what's happening behind the scenes here. So you see that we basically just have these three different pills here with different colored glasses, and the color of glasses represent which team that they're a part of. So we have a red one, a blue one, and a green one. And then essentially I have it set up so I can press the keys 1 through 4, which are going to spawn different attacks into the world. Right now I just have the attacks essentially applying to all the characters within the scene. But later on in kind of say the next portion where we're looking into the more kind of complex ability system, that's where we'd actually implement like, targeting and, damaging specific entities. So just for right now, they're kind of just damaging everybody within the scene. So if I can say press the number 1 key, you'll see that it kind of spawns some damage into the world, and damage has been applied to the green and the blue entities here. Now it doesn't damage the red entity. The reason for that is because these say damage elements I'm spawning into the world, they all have some kind of team association. So I'm associating all these attacks with the red team, so that's why you'll see that the red enemy is not going to take damage. Now if I say spawn a couple more of these damage elements, you'll see that the blue the blue character is taking damage at a higher rate than the green character, and that's because we have some kind of like damage multiplication on there. So we can think of, say, the green entity has kind of some sort of armor where they don't take as much physical damage as the blue one would. And then also we can go ahead and refresh their health, and then the next key here, I can just use a different type of attack that affects now the green enemy more than the blue one. So and then the last one that I want to have, the last one that I do want to showcase is I do also have a damage over time ability. So I can press it once, and then you see, hands off the keyboard, but it's still kind of applying damage every, once every second or so. And one other thing that I want to point out is I am kind of doing some like damage effects. So if you look at like the actual color of each of these players, when we're damaging them, they just kind of like flash red, and then that kind of like fades out over time. So anyways, that's just kind of a little bit long-winded way to showcase this little simple project here. So I'll kind of get into a little bit of the code and showcase you what's going on. Yeah, I'll open the code first here. So we'll start with the actual damage components. So essentially the way that this works is we're going to have different structs for, say, the maximum hit points and the current hit points. I've chosen to separate these out into two separate components. Even though most often we are going to be kind of accessing these both at the same time, it just kind of makes sense to separate them out, because the max hit points, we're pretty much always going to be reading from that. There's not much of a reason for us to set the max hit points very frequently, but the current hit points, this is something that we're going to be constantly modifying. So just kind of makes sense from a data dependency standpoint to just separate those out, because we're kind of accessing those for different reasons. So next up I have a couple enums. So here's one for the damage type. So again, we can have, say, like physical damage, magic damage, poisoning, and I've also added healing as essentially a damage type. If you wanted, you could add healing as something like, kind of completely separate from damage. But for kind of simplicity's sake, I've chosen to add healing into the whole kind of, same setup. So it all kind of works the same. And then we also have a team type enum. So again, each entity and each damage element can have some team association. And then you see that we actually are, assigning this through a component. So we have our entity team, and then it just has that team type value here. So now here's where we start to get into some things that are kind of a little bit more specific to Unity ECS. So this is where we essentially create a damage buffer. The reason that we do this is because for a couple of reasons, there are a couple of different situations where, maybe one entity could take damage multiple times in one frame, from different, say, sources of damage. So it kind of makes sense for us to have a dynamic buffer, which is basically just a collection of all these damage entities, so that we can kind of, queue all those up from different places in our code base. And then later, kind of towards the end of the frame, then we'll actually have a system that runs through that damage buffer and then actually applies the damage to the entity. Damage properties, this is kind of what's associated with the actual damage entity, just to kind of like, these are the things that we're going to be setting, on the particular damage entity for it to add to this damage buffer later on. And you can see that these are just kind of the basic things where it has, some notion about, what the damage type is, what team is that damage entity associated with, and how many hit points it is. Damage over time, it's, pretty much we have the same three first ones here, but it is a little bit more because we also want to have, say, like a timer so we can actually kind of apply damage over time on some sort of interval. So I've kind of used these different timers for tracking that interval timer there, which we'll talk about later. And then here's where I have these damage multipliers. You can see that these are all just public floats. So the way that I've chosen to do this, there may be some different ways that we could do this, but I've chosen to do this with different components for these different damage multipliers. So we have just a physical damage multiplier, magic damage multiplier, and poison damage multiplier. And so basically the idea is if we have this component on there, then we would say multiply the incoming damage by this multiplier. So if the damage was 10 and then we had some armor on that makes it so it's like we only take 50% of physical damage, then we just do that multiplication and then we figure out what that output damage is, and I'll show you that code later on. Then we also have some companion components for doing some UI stuff. So here is the health bar UI. I've kind of talked about this type of thing before where, the idea with the cleanup components is that when this new entity is spawned, then it's going to go ahead and spawn a new health bar associated with that entity. It's going to keep it updated in the correct position in the world. And then we also have a reference to it for when we want to actually update that slider. And then finally, when our entity is destroyed, it will also go ahead and use some of the benefits of the cleanup component to actually destroy this associated game object. Do just have a health bar offset to, offset that health bar just a little bit there. And then I have an enableable component for update health bar UI. Just so we're not updating the health bar every single frame. It's just only when we need it, we can just enable that component and then it will update the health bar. And then lastly, I do have a damage flash timer here to just kind of keep track of flashing that entity red. There are a couple other things here that we'll get into a little bit later on, but those are just kind of a general overview of the components. Danny, how are we looking on things? Do you have any questions so far, or just keep rolling?
No, not so far. Just keep
All right.
rolling.
Sounds
I do
good.
think some people have some interesting questions already, so I think
Awesome.
we'll get to those later.
Yeah, looking forward to it. Anyways, so let me just go ahead and show what the authoring component looks like. So if we look at hit points authoring. So this is basically where we're just going to go ahead and define, all these variables within the editor. So of course we have our max hit points. We can set what team the entity is on. And then what I've done here is actually have Booleans and floats for our different damage multiplications. So you'll see that I have, a public bool for multiply physical damage. And then so basically if that's checked in the editor, then it's going to add the physical damage multiplier component, and it's going to set the value that we have assigned here. So I've done that same thing for the physical damage, magic damage, and poison damage. Of course, we can set the health bar UI offsets and the flash timer here, and then we'll get to this one later. But you can see that basically inside the baker, we're doing just pretty basic things about adding the components that we need. And then here's where we can do a little bit of logic where we can say if the authoring dot multiply physical damage, then we'll go ahead and add that physical damage multiplier here. So I can kind of demonstrate this in action here. If we come over to Unity, you can see when we have, make this a little wider, if we have the multiply physical damage, we can go ahead and check mark this. And then now we can look kind of down in our entity baking preview. We should be able to see the physical damage multiplier somewhere down here. Yes, so we have the physical damage multiplier right here, and we can see the value is set to 0.5. And then if we uncheck that, then that component is no longer present in this sort of area here. So again, just kind of like going back to the separation of these different entities. So we have the blue entity. This entity is just taking just kind of the regular damage because we have these boxes all unchecked here. However, the green entity, this one has the boxes for physical damage and magic damage checked. So you can see that physical damage, it takes just 0.5, basically 50% of damage. And then the magic damage multiplier is 2, so it takes double damage from magic. So again, we can go here, and then if I'm dealing physical damage, you can see that the blue one is, basically more affected, and the green one is less affected. And then if we do magic damage, then again, now the green one is basically taking double damage. So let's actually get into how this damage is being dealt. And first, I'm just going to real quickly showcase the Q damage system. I'm going to say don't pay too much attention to the particular details of how I'm kind of setting things up in here. Because again, this is most likely going to be replaced by, say having multiple systems in your game. That's like, if you're like looking at like collision events or just kind of other ways that you're applying damage throughout your code base, that's kind of what this is going to be replaced by. However, in this case, what I'm doing is I'm just kind of like, creating a damage entity and then just applying this to all entities that can take damage essentially. So you can see, basically just kind of what I'm doing here is, just creating these new damage entities. We're going to add a component data to it, which is just these damage properties. And then here I'm just manually setting, say we're dealing physical damage. It's going to be a part of the red team, and then for 10 points. When I press the 2 key, this one is going to deal basically 2 unique damages of physical entity on the same frame. So that's how we can kind of test that our dynamic buffer is working. Because, so it's like, again, taking damage from 2 sources in one frame. Whereas if we didn't have that buffer and then we're just say, setting the data directly, we wouldn't necessarily be able to do this similar kind of setup, I guess.
I do have just one slight comment, which is
yeah.
Which version? First and foremost, which version of entities are you
on? Good question. I thought 1.2.
Because if you are on 1.2, there's another. I'm pretty sure by this point, me and a colleague added another API, which means what you're doing here can actually be bursted. Because right now you have some very unburstable code.
Yeah, 1.2.
Yeah, you're 1.2. Because you're creating the entity and then immediately adding a component to it. So you're creating an archetype and then immediately moving to a separate archetype, instead of just
Good point.
creating the correct entity up front and then setting the damage properties, which is generally recommended. But yeah, that's my main comment. Also, the reason I'm asking for the version is that in entities 1.2, I think it was at that version we added it, you can do create entity and then pass in component type. You can actually try it with one of them. Instead of the type of, do stack alloc. Yeah, and then say component type, I think it is. Yeah, and then square braces.
Square braces or
Yeah,
angle braces?
and then directly after curly braces. Yeah, and then you can say component type dot damage destroy entity tag, I guess it is. Read only, read write. That doesn't matter which one you pick. Yeah, and then you can pick the other component type as well. You can do commas in between.
So then we could do like this, and then component type dot, do another read only for damage properties, and then
yes,
here then what you want me to do is system API set component.
Yeah, there you go.
Look at that.
And now you've set up the archetype correctly up front, and not only that, this is also burstable. The other thing was not burstable because you were using type of and a managed array, whereas stack alloc is just a pointer and therefore completely valid.
Awesome.
So this is burstable, and it's
very helpful.
Not a archetype change.
Sweet.
But otherwise, now you can go on, and people can repeat this pattern for every case where they see a create entity and then an add component. Ideally, people shouldn't be doing create entity, then adding XYZ.
Fair.
They should be just setting it up correctly up front and then start setting a bunch of stuff.
Nice. I like that a lot. Cool. Well, I would definitely be using that more. So yeah, anyways, getting back to what I'm doing here. So yeah, again, I did see a comment in there about creating like damageable entities. And I think that actually, it may seem a little bit kind of counterintuitive at first, but there's some really cool things that we can do with it. And I think particularly when we get into kind of the ability system stuff, which we'll be showcasing the week after next, you can see why it is kind of helpful to have like an entity associated with these different things that we can add different components to, and that, the existence of having those components, it can kind of change the behaviors. So we can have, certain systems, affect entities, when we have particular components, and then we can change that around and other systems will impact them. So then, they can do things in a different way. So it just gives us a lot of flexibility, and, all our code isn't kind of tied together in nasty ways, and we can kind of, just kind of plug and play and have fun with our game design and everything. So anyways, now that we have a more efficient damage entity creation, we can see what we're going to go ahead and do here is, so yeah, I just do nested for each loops here, just looking for anything with those damage properties, essentially these, damage entities that we just created. You see the variable name is cur damage properties. And then inside this for loop, then so in this case, we're looking through all those damage entities that we just created. Again, in most cases, there's just going to be one, but in those, edge cases where I'm saying creating multiple per frame, that's why we would want to actually iterate through this. And again, just kind of sticking with the ECS pattern of us preferring, iterating over things rather than, doing things one off. This is why we're using a for each on this collection here. So then on the inner loop, now here's where we actually loop across all the entities that can receive damage. So again, in this case, this is just those 3 entities within our main scene. And you see that we're just looking for the dynamic buffer of these damage buffer elements. And then so we just get a reference to our damage buffer here. And then you see we just add these new damage buffer elements to the damage buffer. And all we're doing is just setting the damage type, damage team, and hit points. And again, we're just getting those from the cur damage properties of that damage entity that we're iterating across. So again, we'll iterate through all those damageable entities. Inside that loop, we'll iterate across all the entities that can take damage, and then we're just adding the damage buffer to them. And you see, at this point, we're not doing any like pre-filtering for, checking for friendly fire or anything like that. We're just adding this damage buffer, or we're just adding this damage element to this buffer, and then we can kind of handle the cases like friendly fire and things like that later on. So basically what this does is this just kind of, again, queues up these damage elements. And what I can actually probably do is I'm just going to go ahead and disable my applied damage system. Just by doing a disable auto creation here. And then what I can kind of show you is when we actually spawn these damage entities, you can just see these all just get queued up in the damage buffer here. So I'll go ahead and spawn a damage entity. And if we say, look at this player here, you can see we can scroll down to this damage buffer element buffer, and we have just one element on here. And you'll see that it is, physical damage on the red team for 10 hit points. And then all the players basically have this same data here. So it's, again, not doing any pre-filtering based off of team. It's not modifying this hit points based off of, if they have armor on or anything like that. And again, if we say, spawn another one, which is, say, the magic damage, then you can see this on here. And then if we also do the damage over time one, then we can see that it'll, add a couple more of these elements for, poison there. So that is kind of the basics of, just adding to this damage buffer. And then the final kind of stage of this is actually applying the damage. So what this does here is this is a little bit, longer and a little bit more involved here, just because we have to start to take into consideration, some of those different damage multipliers and things like that we're adding in here. So in our for each here, we're going to look for, we need read and write access to the current hit points, because again, at the end, this is where we're, actually modifying the hit points value. We do also want a reference to our max hit points. So we can say, if we are refilling our health, we don't want to go over the maximum, of course. Our damage buffer is, that buffer that we're just populating. And of course we want a reference to the entity team, so we can take into account friendly fire and all that. We do need our entity access here, so we can kind of do a couple things. So we can check to see what components it has and stuff like that. And then the filter right group, I'll get into that kind of at the end. So what I'm doing here is I just am doing a looping through everything in the damage buffer. And then here we're just going to do a switch on the damage type. So we can see, if it's physical damage, first thing that we want to do is just ignore friendly fire. So then we can say, if the value of the entity team is equal to the team of the damage element, then just go ahead and ignore friendly fire here. So this is, again, where we're doing our kind of pre-filtering. And then here's where we can actually calculate our physical hit points. So we just get that from our damage element, the hit points on here. And then using the system API, we can do a .has component and check to see if it has that physical damage multiplier component there. And then, of course, we just have to pass in the actual entity that we want to see if that is on. And then, once we have that, we can get the actual damage multiplier using our system API.get component. And then here is where we just do that multiplication by taking in the existing physical hit points, multiplying that by our physical damage multiplier, and then assigning that back to our physical hit points. And then at this point, all I'm doing is just kind of adding this to a damage hit point variable. So you can see that I have, say, damage hit points, and then I also down here have healing hit points. The reason that I've chose to do it this way is because if we're taking, say, damage and healing on the same frame, we don't necessarily want those to like counteract each other too much, I guess. So like maybe if we like healed ourselves by some amount and then we're taking damage by some amount, there could be some weird situations where the things wouldn't line up correctly, or if we, let's say, like applied healing first, but that healing pushed us past the maximum value, but then we also took damage. Like it just kind of made sense in my mind to store these as variables, and then we can kind of combine the damage hit points as well as the healing hit points to get kind of like a final value for that frame, if that makes sense. So anyways, and then of course we'll just do the same thing for the different damage types and healing types. For healing, the only difference is would be the opposite of friendly fire, so you can only heal from the same team essentially. One thing that we do want to make sure to do is clear our damage buffer, because we only want these damage elements kind of applying on this particular frame. This is where I do just kind of like calculate the total hit points for that frame there. And then this is where I actually set the value on the current hit points, and then we also just want to make sure it doesn't go above the maximum here. And then here's where we can do some just additional checks to see if current hit points is less than 0, we'll add a destroy entity tag on there. If you have a health bar, let's go ahead and set the component enabled on the update health bar UI, so we'll actually go ahead and prompt the UI system to update that health bar. And then, so yeah, then this one, it says, basically if we're taking negative damage in a frame, then this is where I basically prompt the damage flash timer to essentially reset itself so that it can kind of apply a little damage flash to that there. Okay, so now I can just kind of come back here, and actually pretty much nothing has really changed at this point, but I can just kind of give you a quick little visual where again, if we're applying damage, it's going to apply the damage that we're setting there. And again, we can kind of come in here and we can say, let's go on this entity, and let's say this one will multiply its physical damage by 5 would be a lot, but whatever, we'll just make it real obvious. So if we deal physical damage now, it takes half its health, and of course when it goes below 0, then it actually gets destroyed here. And then what I can also show you is we can do something a little bit more complex by using a concept known as write groups. So what I have here is a tag for the ignore damage multiplication tag, and you see that this has an attribute for the write group, and it's targeting the type of current hit points. The idea with this is if we have a system such as the apply damage system, which fits 2 requirements, the 2 requirements being we are writing to the current hit points, again, which is that the write group that we're targeting. This is why it's called the write group, is if we're writing to that component type. And we also do have this with options of entity query options .filter write group enabled. What this means is if a entity with this ignore damage multiplication tag component exists, then it will not it will no longer be impacted by this query that we're generating here. So the idea is that we can essentially override the behavior. So again, I call this the ignore damage multiplication tag. So then we have so that it no longer does our regular apply damage system, but instead we can say, hey, if we add this tag component, we can maybe apply damage in a completely different way. So for example, I have this apply unscaled damage system where it just basically does a much simpler implementation where it doesn't have to do all that checking to see, hey, does it have, this multiplication component and then do that multiplication. it just applies the damage directly. So now if I were to say, come over to here, and then on this player, even though it has the multiply physical damage and we have physical damage multiplier set to 5x, let's go ahead and add that should ignore damage multiplication, and then you see it will add that component down here. So now when we apply physical damage, it's just going to apply just the regular one-time scaled. It doesn't apply 5x scaled anymore. So that's something that, kind of cool that you can do is you can say, hey, we have this kind of regular apply damage system, but maybe there are some cases where I want to apply damage in a completely different way. Maybe I want to, have a mode of my game where I'm ignoring friendly fire. In that case, you could, create a new system where it applies damage and then it, ignores those friendly fire restrictions on there. And you could, again, just have some like tag that you could add to your entities to say, hey, ignore friendly fire. Or maybe even as we get into the kind of more complex ability system, you can have damage elements that when a player gets hit by something, then it will add a component to them so that now damage is calculated in a different way. So definitely like a lot of cool stuff there. So that's kind of like a good overview about kind of how this damage system set up. Danny, do you have any questions before we get into the questions from the audience? But is there anything that you kind of have for me or anything that you want to learn a little bit more about?
I don't think I have anything. I'm personally not a big fan of filter right groups just because I think they're overcomplicated, and in most cases you could just do it with none. But other than that,
Makes sense.
I think it's good that you explained what a filter right group is, because it is something that most people don't quite know what is.
Yeah. I think they're interesting, and I think there are some cases where they're useful. But yeah.
Oh, and also I did notice your allocator.temp, which is often it can be better to just use state.world update allocator because it's a rewindable allocator. So it's a little bit quicker.
For like the entity command buffer?
Yeah.
State world update allocator. All right.
Exactly. Yeah. There you go.
Sweet. Awesome. Well, I will go ahead.
That one gets it is like a back buffer to buffer approach where every frame it switches between one buffer and the other. And so after 2 frames, it has been cleared. And
cool.
For the most part, already pre-allocated.
It's like a dual clutch. It's like a dual clutch transmission.
Yeah. Or like how vsync works. Vsync is normally also like a double buffered approach.
Gotcha.
Where you write to the back texture while the front texture is shown, and then you flip. Yeah.